Ruby Sawyer had not spoken a single voluntary word in 3 years, 2 months, and 11 days, and the morning Wallace Ford rode into Caldwell, Kansas. She was standing behind the mercantile counter counting bolts of calico like a woman counting down the last grains of sand in an hourglass she had no interest in flipping over. The year was 1882, and Caldwell sat right at the edge of the Kishom Trail, a town that smelled of cattle dust and ambition, and a particular brand of loneliness that settled into the bones of every soul who stayed too long. It was a border town in the truest sense, where Kansas met Indian Territory, where law met lawlessness in a handshake that neither side fully trusted. The streets were wide enough for a cattle drive, which was useful, because cattle drives still came through regular as the seasons. The wooden storefronts wore their sun-bleached paint like old men wore their wrinkles, with neither pride nor shame, just the evidence of time. Ruby was 26 years old. She had dark chestnut hair that she kept pinned so tightly it stretched the skin at her temples, and green eyes that people in Caldwell had stopped looking into because there was something uncomfortable there, something like a door shut so firmly that the hinges had rusted over. She was not unfriendly. She handed change correctly. She wrapped parcels with precision. She nodded when nodding was required. But she did not speak, and nobody in Caldwell asked her to any more because they had all learned, over the course of the 3 years since she had arrived with a single trunk and a letter of employment, that Ruby Sawyer's silence was not a temporary condition. The mercantile was owned by a stout, good-natured widow named Harriet Bloom, who had hired Ruby sight unseen based on the letter alone, and who had come to love Ruby in the uncomplicated way one loves a well-made piece of furniture. She appreciated her, she relied on her, and she had stopped expecting conversation from her the way one stops expecting a rocking chair to speak. Harriet communicated with Ruby through notes left on the counter, and a series of practical gestures that had evolved naturally over time. Ruby responded by doing what was needed, doing it well, and returning to her place behind the counter where she watched Caldwell go about its loud, messy, fully voiced business through the front window. What had happened to Ruby Sawyer was not a mystery to Ruby Sawyer. She knew exactly when she had stopped speaking and exactly why. She had been married at 23 to a man named Clement Sawyer, a banker from Wichita with a good suit and a persuasive smile, and in the first weeks of that marriage she had learned that Clement's definition of a proper wife was a silent one. He had refined his methods of ensuring that silence gradually but thoroughly, through a cold architecture of dismissal and correction, and something more severe that Ruby kept locked in a room at the back of herself where she did not allow visitors. She had left him in the night with her trunk and someone else's horse, and a divorce that his lawyers had contested for 6 months before finally processing, and she had arrived in Caldwell because Caldwell was far from Wichita and Harriet Bloom had needed help. The silence had started as protection and had stayed as habit, and the habit had calcified into something Ruby no longer questioned. She did not miss her voice the way she might miss a limb. It felt more like she had simply stopped believing her voice had anything worth delivering to a world that had not been particularly kind in response to the things she had once said freely. She was thinking none of this when Wallace Ford came through the door, because she rarely thought about it directly. It lived in her the way old injuries live, not as a constant active pain, but as a permanent alteration in the architecture of a person. The bell above the door announced him, and Ruby did not look up from the bolt of calico. She was measuring against the yardstick nailed to the edge of the counter. She heard his boots, which were worn in a particular way, the left heel coming down half a beat after the right in a slight but noticeable rhythm. She heard him stop and get his bearings, the way people do when they enter a new space. She heard him exhale. "Afternoon," he said, to the room in general rather than to her specifically, which she appreciated. She looked up then briefly, as a matter of courtesy, and saw a man who appeared to be somewhere in his early 30s, though the sun had worked on him enough that she could have been wrong by a few years in either direction. He was tall without being imposing, lean in the way of men who work hard and eat when they can. He wore a trail coat that had seen considerable weather and a hat that had once been brown, and was now the color of the road itself. His face had a quality that Ruby noticed before she could stop herself noticing it, which was that it looked like an honest face, not in the naive way of someone who had never been lied to, but in the earned way of someone who had been lied to enough that they had decided honesty was the only currency worth trading in. He came to the counter and set a folded piece of paper down. "I need to fill this order if you have what's on it," he said. "I'm not in a particular hurry if you need to check the back." Ruby took the paper and read it. Flour, 2 grades of coffee, salt, a coil of rope, a tin of axle grease, 2 pairs of work gloves, a bottle of liniment, and a box of ammunition in a specific caliber. She looked up at him and gave a single nod, then moved to begin pulling the items. She had done this 10,000 times, and she moved through the mercantile with the quiet efficiency of someone who knew exactly where everything was. She was aware of him watching her, not in the way that made her skin crawl, which was a specific and familiar sensation, but in a way that felt more like someone watching a river, simply observing the fact of something moving. When she had everything assembled on the counter, she wrote the total on a slip of paper and turned it toward him. He looked at it, then looked at her. "You don't talk much," he said, without accusation or mockery. It was stated the same way one might observe that the sky was clear. Ruby held his gaze for a moment and then looked back at the slip of paper. "That's all right," he said, reaching into his coat for his money. "I've found that the quiet ones usually have the most worth saying when they finally say it." He paid the exact amount, counted out carefully, and began loading his purchases into the canvas sacks he had brought with him. He was nearly done when he said, without looking up, "My name is Wallace Ford. I've taken a position as trail boss on the Grady Cattle Company's fall drive. We'll be coming back through Caldwell in about 6 weeks. I'll likely need to resupply then." He picked up his sacks and looked at her directly, and his eyes were a particular shade of brown that Ruby found herself categorizing involuntarily as warm, which annoyed her. "I hope you'll still be here," he said, and it was a simple thing to say, a practical thing, referring to commerce and supply, but something about the way he said it made it feel like it was referring to something more than that. He went out the door and the bell announced his departure, and Ruby stood behind the counter and watched through the window as he loaded his horse, a large gray with a white blaze, and rode south toward the trail. She stood there for a moment longer than was strictly necessary. Then she went back to measuring calico. 6 weeks was a specific thing to say. She noted that she noticed it. The 6 weeks passed the way 6 weeks in Caldwell always passed, in a rhythm of cattle and commerce and weather, and the low background noise of men who had been on the trail too long spending their wages in ways that would embarrass them in the morning. Ruby moved through all of it like a still point in a turning world, steady and contained and unreachable. But something had happened, small and almost imperceptible, like a crack in a window pane that only shows itself when the light hits it at a certain angle. She found herself paying attention to the door in a way she hadn't before. Not dramatically, not in a way that interfered with her work, but with a background awareness that she recognized, after some time spent examining it, as anticipation. She did not know what to do with that recognition, so she set it aside the way she set aside most things that she did not know what to do with. Harriet noticed nothing, because Harriet was navigating her own considerable set of concerns, which included a dispute with the hardware merchant next door about a shared wall and a letter from her sister in St. Louis that had arrived written entirely in complaint. October came to Caldwell on a northwest wind that stripped the color from the plains in a single long exhale, leaving everything the particular gold brown of spent season. The cattle drives that came through in October had a different energy than the summer ones, driven faster, the men more tired, the animals thinner from the long miles. Wallace Ford came back on a Tuesday. Ruby knew it was him before the bell finished ringing because of the particular rhythm of his boots, left heel half a beat after right, and she thought, with a precision that startled her, I remembered that. She looked up. He looked better than she remembered, which was an unwelcome observation. He had the look of a man who had completed something difficult and felt the satisfaction of it, trailed dust on his coat and a cut healing clean above his left eyebrow, and the same honest quality in his face that she had catalogued and apparently retained. "Miss Sawyer," he said. She went still for just a moment because he had used her name, and she had not given it to him, which meant he had asked someone in town, which meant he had come back with the specific intention of knowing her name, and she did not know what to do with that at all. She gave him a look that she hoped communicated a question. "I asked the woman at the hotel," he said, reading her expression with an accuracy that was disarming. "I hope that's not forward of me. It seemed important to know your name." Ruby set down the pencil she was holding and waited. He took off his hat and held it by the brim, turning it slightly in his hands, which was the first time she had seen him display anything resembling nerves. "I have another order," he said, "but that's not entirely why I came in." He paused. "I thought about you out on the trail. Not in any improper way, I want to be clear about that. I thought about the fact of you, the way you went about your work, the way you didn't feel the need to fill the air with noise." He looked at the hat in his hands. "I'm not a man who says things unless I mean them, and I mean to say that I'd like to talk to you. Or I suppose, more accurately, I'd like you to be somewhere near me while I talk, and maybe at some point you'll feel like responding, and if you don't, that'll be all right too." It was the strangest and most carefully honest thing anyone had said to Ruby in 3 years. She picked up a blank slip of paper and wrote on it, "You can leave your supply order. I will have it ready by tomorrow morning." She slid it across the counter. He read it and a slow smile moved across his face, not the wide, easy smile of a man performing charm, but a smaller, more personal thing, like a light coming on in a window. "All right," he said. "Can I come back tonight? There's a decent enough place across the street that I'm told has edible food. I wondered if you might want to eat in public like two normal people while I do most of the talking." Ruby stared at him for a long moment. Then she took the paper back and wrote, "I will be done here at 6. He looked at the paper and then at her, and the smile happened again. "6 o'clock, he said. At 6 o'clock, Ruby Sawyer had unpinned her hair and repinned it with a little less severity, which was the most significant act of personal adjustment she had made in 3 years. She put on her second-best dress, which was a deep green wool that Harriet had made her accept last Christmas under the pretext of it being a business expense, since Ruby was the public face of the mercantile. She looked at herself in the small mirror above her washstand in her room above the store and did not recognize herself immediately, which had less to do with the dress and more to do with something in her expression that she could not quite identify. Something like alertness. Something that had not been there yesterday. Wallace Ford was waiting outside the mercantile. He had cleaned up considerably and wore a dark shirt that was recently pressed and boots that had been polished, which she suspected was deliberate. He offered her his arm with the slightly formal courtesy of a man who had been raised with manners and had kept them despite years of circumstances that might have eroded them. She took his arm. They crossed the street to the restaurant, which was called Miners, a name that made no geographical sense in Caldwell, Kansas, but had survived on the basis of its corn bread alone. The proprietress, a Mrs. Adeline Trott, seated them with an expression that Ruby recognized as the particular look Caldwell reserved for anything that deviated from established pattern, which was a combination of avid interest and studied casualness. Wallace ordered for both of them without fuss, and when the food came, he ate with the uncomplicated appreciation of a man who had been living on trail provisions and meant every bite. He talked the way he had promised, filling the space naturally without seeming to require her participation in any specific form. He talked about the cattle drive, about the 140 miles from Texas with 1,100 head and a crew of 8. He talked about a creek crossing near Red Rock that had gone sideways when the lead steer decided the opposite bank wasn't to his liking, and the 3 hours it had taken to redirect the herd. He talked about the night sky in Indian Territory, which he described with a specificity and reverence that surprised her, the particular arrangement of stars in early October, the way the Milky Way spread itself out like a road going somewhere you couldn't quite see. He talked about his life in broad strokes. He was from Tennessee originally, had come west at 21 after the war had taken his father, and left the family farm in a condition that was beyond recovery. He had worked cattle for 10 years with various outfits and had a talent for it, for reading the land and managing men and keeping a herd pointed in one direction, which was a more complicated skill than it sounded. He had never married. He had spent most of his adult life moving, which he said without self-pity, but also without pride, simply as a fact about himself that he had come to understand and was beginning to examine. Ruby ate her food and listened and found, to her own quiet astonishment, that she was fully present, her attention not divided or guarded in the usual way, but simply there, in the room with him, taking in every word with an interest she had forgotten was possible. At one point he said, "You're listening in a particular way. I can't quite describe it. It makes a man want to say something worth the listening." She looked down at her plate and felt heat in her face, which she acknowledged with some mortification was a blush, and which she had not experienced in so long she had assumed that capacity had been permanently retired. When they were done and the coffee was in front of them, he leaned back in his chair and looked at her with a directness that was not unkind. "Can I ask you something?" he said. She folded her hands on the table. She supposed that was as close to yes as she could get without a paper and pencil. "Is the quiet a choice?" he asked. "Or is it something that happened to you?" It was the most precisely correct question anyone had ever asked her about it. The distinction he was drawing, between choice and happening, between agency and consequence, was a distinction she herself had never put into words even internally, and the accuracy of it landed somewhere central. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she held up one hand and tilted it back and forth in a gesture that meant something between both and neither, and he accepted that without pressing further, which was the correct response. "I won't ask again unless you want to tell me," he said. He left her at the door of the mercantile at 8:30, with the mannerly distance of a man who understood that trust is not a thing that is given on an evening's acquaintance, but is built, slow and careful, like a house that has to hold against weather. "I'm staying at the hotel for the week while the Grady outfit settles accounts," he said. "I'd like to do this again if you're amenable." Ruby looked at him for a moment, then gave a single, clear nod. The warm thing happened in his expression again. "Good night, Miss Sawyer," he said, and put his hat back on and walked across the street. Ruby stood in the dark doorway of the mercantile for a moment after he had gone in, and she was aware of something moving in her that she had no immediate name for, something that was not quite happiness, but was in that family, the way a cousin resembles someone without being them. She went upstairs to her room and lay in her bed and looked at the ceiling for a long time before she slept. The week that followed had a structure to it that felt, to Ruby, like something being built. Wallace came to the mercantile each morning, not to buy anything in particular but to be there, leaning against the counter with his hat in his hands, talking about whatever was present in his mind while Ruby worked. He was good at talking in a way that didn't demand anything. He told stories about the trail with the particular detail of someone who observed the world carefully, small things. The way a particular cowhand named Devereaux always sang quietly to the cattle at night in a low off-key baritone that nevertheless seemed to settle them. The way prairie dogs had an entire social architecture that, when you watched it long enough, started to feel uncomfortably relatable. He made her laugh. It happened on the third day, when he was describing the incident of the lead steer at the Red Rock crossing in greater detail than he had at dinner, and the particular expression on the steer's face as he reconsidered the bank. And Ruby made a sound that surprised both of them, a brief, sudden exhalation that was unambiguously a laugh. And then she covered her mouth with her hand and looked at him with wide eyes. He grinned at her with the full, unguarded version of his smile, the one she hadn't seen yet, and it was considerably more powerful than the smaller versions. "There it is," he said quietly, as though he had found something he had been looking for. On the fourth day, they took a walk along the edge of town in the early evening where Caldwell dissolved into the open plain, and the sky was doing the particular thing it does in Kansas in October, where the light goes sideways and gold, and makes everything look as though it has been painted by someone with strong feelings. They walked without speaking, which was the most comfortable silence Ruby had been in for a long time because it felt like a shared thing rather than a performance of absence. He stopped at one point and pointed west where a line of cottonwoods marked a dry creek bed, their leaves gone to yellow and shaking in the wind. "I've been trying to decide something," he said, to the cottonwoods rather than to her. She waited. "Whether I want to keep moving," he said. "I've been good at moving. It's a specific skill. But I've started to wonder if it's a skill or just a habit I've mistaken for a skill." He was quiet for a moment. "The Grady family has a property north of Caldwell, about 12 miles out. They're looking for someone to manage it year-round. It's not the most glamorous proposition, but it's land and it's a wage and it's stopping." He turned and looked at her. "I think I'd like to stop," he said. Ruby met his eyes and held them, and she felt that something was being communicated in the space between them that was too large and too new to be said directly, so it was being said sideways, which was sometimes how the most important things had to be said. She took the small notepad she had started carrying with her and wrote, "That sounds like a good decision." He read it, and his smile was quiet and personal. "Yeah," he said, "I think so too." On the fifth day, a man rode into Caldwell who made Ruby's breath go tight in her chest. He was sitting outside the mercantile with Harriet when she saw him through the window, a man in a good suit on a horse too fine for the local livery, and even from inside and at that distance she knew the shape of him with a body-level recognition that had nothing to do with wanting. Clement Sawyer had found her. She did not understand how he had found her. The divorce had been finalized for 2 years. He had no legal standing to be here. She stood behind the counter and felt herself become very still in the particular way she became still when she was afraid. Not frozen but compressed, everything drawn inward and made small. Harriet came inside with her face doing something complicated that involved embarrassment and apology. "Ruby, dear," Harriet said, using the careful voice she reserved for difficult things, "there is a gentleman outside who says he is your former husband and that he needs to speak with you about a family matter." Ruby shook her head. She shook it twice, with clear emphasis. "He says it's important," Harriet said miserably. Ruby wrote on her notepad with a hand that was steadier than she felt. "I have nothing to say to him and nothing he says concerns me." She showed it to Harriet, who read it and sighed and went back outside. Ruby watched through the window as Harriet spoke to Clement, and she watched his face go through a series of expressions that she recognized and categorized without feeling anything in particular about them beyond the old, careful wariness. He left. He rode out and she watched him go and she breathed. What she did not know was that Wallace Ford was coming along the street from the hotel direction and had passed Clement Sawyer on the way, and had noted the well-dressed man on the expensive horse with the professional attentiveness of someone who read situations for a living. He came into the mercantile and looked at Ruby with the directness she had come to expect from him. "You all right?" he said. She nodded. He did not push, but he also did not leave immediately in the way of someone who has decided, without making a production of it, to simply be present for a while. He sat on the stool near the counter and talked about ordinary things, the supply schedule, the weather, the peculiarities of the hotel's breakfast offerings, and Ruby found herself settling back into herself the way a disturbed surface of water settles. That evening at dinner, she wrote him a note. It was the longest thing she had written him, 4 sentences. The man today was my former husband. We have been divorced for 2 years. He has no claim on me. I wanted you to know because it seemed important that you should. He read it and set it down carefully on the table between them. Are you safe? He asked. She considered the question honestly. Then she nodded because she believed it was true. Clement was a man of social standing and the law had been concluded. He would not make a public spectacle and she had nothing he could legally take. All right, Wallace said, but if that changes, I want you to tell me. She looked at him across the table and thought that being told someone wanted her to tell them something was an experience so unfamiliar it was almost destabilizing. She wrote, "Why?" He read the single word and looked up at her with complete seriousness. "Because you matter to me," he said. "That happened faster than I expected, but there it is." Ruby looked at the tablecloth. Then she looked at her hands. Then she looked at him because it was the only honest response to an honest statement. She wrote, "You matter to me also." That also surprised me. He read it and she watched something in him that had been carefully maintained go quietly loose like a knot being untied. "Good," he said. "That's very good." He walked her home again that night, and at the door he stopped with a different quality of stillness than usual, and she looked up at him in the dark of the doorway, the street noise of Caldwell at evening going on around them, and he lifted his hand and very carefully, with the question clear in his eyes before he did it, tucked a loose strand of her hair back from her face. It was nothing. It was everything. It was the first time in 3 years that someone had touched her in a way that meant tenderness rather than control, and Ruby stood in the doorway and felt it go all the way through her like a bell being rung. "Good night, Ruby," he said. He had used her first name. She looked at him for a moment and then she opened her mouth and something happened that she had not planned, that emerged from some place below planning. And she said, in a voice so rough with disuse that it barely sounded like a voice at all, ragged and uncertain and barely above a whisper, "Good night." 1 word, 2 syllables. Her own voice, unrecognizable to her own ears, scraping back into the world after 3 years of silence. Wallace went very still. Ruby felt her hand come up to her own mouth, touching it as though checking that it had actually happened, that the sound had actually come from her. "Ruby," he said very quietly, "nothing else." Just her name, the way you might say something you wanted to be sure was real. She was shaking slightly. She could feel it in her hands. It was not fear, it was something else entirely, something that had been dammed up for so long that the first crack in the wall was violent in its own quiet way. He did not make a large thing of it. He looked at her with the kind of careful regard that said he understood the magnitude without needing to turn it into theater, and he said simply, "I'll see you tomorrow." She nodded, still touching her mouth. He went across the street. Ruby went upstairs and sat on the edge of her bed for a long time. Then, alone in her room, she said it again just to herself to be sure it was still there. "Good night," her voice, still there, rough as a road not traveled but there. She pressed her hands together in her lap and sat with that for a long time. The next morning she said good morning to Harriet. It was 2 words, barely audible, delivered while she was hanging her coat on the peg by the back door, and Harriet dropped the teapot she was holding, not hard enough to break it, but hard enough to make a considerable noise, and then turned and looked at Ruby with an expression that moved through shock and joy, and the particular tearful pleasure of someone who has been hoping for something for a very long time. "Good morning," Harriet said back, in a voice like she was handling something fragile and precious. "Ruby, good morning." Ruby's throat ached with it. It hurt in the way that muscles hurt when they have been inactive and are called back into use, a real physical sensation, the body remembering what it was made for. She did not become immediately voluble. That was not how recovery works, and Ruby was not performing recovery, she was doing it, which was a slower and less theatrical process. But she spoke. In small pieces, functional pieces, words returned to their original purpose of communicating what needed to be communicated. When Wallace came in that morning, she said, as he came through the door, "I set your last order aside." and her voice was still rough, but it was hers, and it was real, and it was in the room. He stopped when he heard it. He stood in the doorway for a moment with his hat in his hand and looked at her with the full force of that brown-eyed, honest attention, and he said, "I hear you." It was the most correct possible thing to say. The week turned into 2. He accepted the position with the Grady property and began making the transition from trail to land, from moving to staying. The property was 12 miles north of town, a working cattle operation of moderate size with a main house, a bunkhouse, several outbuildings, and enough land to be meaningful. He came into Caldwell regularly for supplies and for Ruby, and the two things were listed with equal weight in his planning. Ruby's voice came back in the way spring comes to the northern plains, not all at once and not without setbacks, but in an accumulating warmth that became, over time, undeniable. There were days when she spoke more and days when the words were fewer, and Wallace navigated this with the same patient intelligence he brought to reading cattle and weather, without comment and without pressure, taking what was offered and not reaching for more than she was giving. She started telling him things. Small things first, the inventory patterns in the mercantile, observations about the particular personalities of Caldwell's regular customers, the way the light changed over the plains at different times of day. And then larger things, carefully, in the way that someone who has been hoarding something for a long time begins to release it slowly, testing whether it's safe. She told him about growing up in Missouri, her father a schoolteacher, her mother a practical woman who had raised 3 children with the efficient love of someone who had more work than time. She told him about the books she had read and the ones she had loved, about Jane Eyre, which she had read 4 times, and about the particular comfort of a story in which a woman refuses to compromise her own worth. She told him these things in his presence and in her own voice, roughened but real, and each time she spoke he listened in the specific way she had first noticed at dinner, with his full attention, the way one listens to something that matters. In December, Clement Sawyer came back. This time he came inside. Ruby was alone in the mercantile, Harriet having gone to visit the minister's wife, and the bell above the door announced him, and Ruby looked up and saw him, and the silence came back with the force of reflex, her throat closing, her body resettling into the old architecture. He was a handsome man, which had always been one of the fundamental complications. He had a quality of confidence that most people read as competence, and only closer acquaintance revealed as the confidence of someone who has never genuinely had their assumptions challenged. "Ruby," he said, "you look well." She said nothing. She was behind the counter and she put her hand on the edge of it to steady herself. "I've been trying to understand why you've made this so complicated," he said, using the voice she remembered, the one that was always reasonable on its surface and always made her feel unreasonable for not agreeing with it. "The divorce was 2 years ago. I have accepted it. I've come with something civil to say." He came to the counter and stood across it from her. "My mother has died," he said. "There was a matter in her estate that your name appears in, a small bequest. I came to deliver the documentation in person because it seemed the decent thing to do." He put a paper on the counter. Ruby looked at it but did not pick it up. "I also wanted to see you," he said, with a shift in his tone that she recognized, the one that came after the reasonable part, the one that was meant to sound like sincerity. "I know things were not right between us. I've done some reflecting." "Then you can direct your reflections to a letter," said a voice from the doorway. Wallace Ford stood in the open doorway with the particular stillness of a man who had assessed a situation in the time it took the door to open. Clement turned and looked at him with the expression of a man who has not been interrupted before and does not care for the experience. "I'm having a private conversation," Clement said. "I see that," Wallace said, coming inside and letting the door close behind him. "And the lady doesn't appear to be participating in it willingly, which makes it something else." He came to the counter and stood beside Ruby, not in front of her, not blocking her, but beside her, in the specific geometry of someone who is offering their presence rather than substituting for it. He looked at Clement with a complete absence of aggression and a complete absence of flexibility. "You can leave that paper and go," Wallace said, "or you can leave without it. Either way, you're done here." Clement looked at Ruby, who was looking at Wallace with an expression she was not managing because she had forgotten to manage it, and whatever was on her face was enough to communicate something to Clement, because his own face shifted through a sequence of emotions and landed on the thin dignity of retreat. "The paper covers the bequest," Clement said to Ruby. "A solicitor in Wichita can advise you on it." He picked up the paper, reconsidered, and set it back down. "I wish you well, Ruby." He left. The bell rang, and then there was quiet. Ruby stood beside Wallace and breathed for a moment. Then she turned and looked at him. He was looking at her, not at the door, not at the street, at her. "He hurt you," Wallace said. It was not a question. It was not an accusation directed at her. It was a statement of understanding, careful and straight. Ruby looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, in the rough and real voice that was becoming more her own every day, "Yes." It was one word, and it was the most she had ever said about it out loud, and it sat in the room between them like something that had been carried a very long way and could finally be set down. "You don't have to tell me any more than that," he said. "I know," she said. "That's why I could say it." He reached across the counter and put his hand over hers where it rested on the wooden edge, and she looked at their hands together and did not move hers away because she didn't want to. "Ruby," he said. "I know," she said again, and something moved across her face that she recognized, eventually, as the preliminary geography of being loved, the approach of it, the first full apprehension that it was actually happening. Christmas in Caldwell that year was a practical affair. The town put up what decorations it could manage against the wind, which treated Garland with a particular contempt, and the churches held their services with the full attendance that prairie winters reliably produced by limiting alternative activities. Harriet decorated the mercantile with pine boughs that a rancher's son had brought in from the cedar breaks, and the shop smelled of resin and cold for the whole month of December. Wallace brought Ruby a book for Christmas. It was a copy of Middlemark by George Eliot, which he had ordered special from a bookseller in Kansas City. He presented it without ceremony, on the morning of Christmas Eve, when she was alone in the shop. She looked at the cover and then at him. "I asked Harriet what you might like," he said, "and she said you were a reader, and I found out what you hadn't read yet." Ruby opened it and looked at the first page and then looked up at him with her eyes doing something that she could not stop because she had not yet fully relearned the habit of managing her expressions, and she said, "Wallace." His name. The first time she had said it directly. He was very still in the way he got when something mattered. "Thank you," she said. "You're welcome," he said. And then he said, "I'd like to take you somewhere on Christmas Day if you're willing. Not into town, out to the property." She looked at him. "I want you to see it," he said simply. "I want you to see what I'm building." They rode out Christmas morning under a sky that was a clear and merciless blue, the plains white with a light coat of snow that the wind had fluted into small, perfect ridges. Wallace rode his gray and had arranged with the livery for a steady chestnut mare that Ruby handled with competence, because she had grown up with horses and had missed them without quite realizing how much. The property 12 miles north was a collection of low buildings arranged sensibly against the prevailing wind, with a main house that was small but solid, and a view to the west that in summer, Wallace told her, went on for what felt like forever. In the snow and the clear winter light it had a particular beauty, austere and honest. He showed her the house first, the inside, which he had been making livable over the past weeks with the methodical attention he brought to everything. There was a stove that worked, 2 rooms of reasonable size, a kitchen that was minimal but functional, and a front window that faced west. Ruby stood at the front window and looked out at the plains. "It needs things," Wallace said, standing in the doorway behind her. "Things I don't know much about, curtains, the right kind of furniture, things that make a place feel like somewhere rather than just a structure." Ruby turned and looked at him. He was leaning in the doorway with his hat off, watching her, and she understood with a clarity that arrived all at once what was being offered, not just the view, not just the house. "Wallace," she said, I'm not trying to move faster than is right, he said. I want to be clear about that. You've had things taken from you, and I won't be another man who takes things. But I want to ask you something honestly. She waited. He came into the room and stood before her with the hat turning in his hands and the full honesty of his face undisguised. Is this something you want? He said. This and me in it. Because if you do, I think we could build something real here. And if you don't, or if you're not sure, that's also an honest answer and I'll respect it completely. Ruby stood at the front window with the winter plains at her back and looked at this man. This particular honest man with the warm brown eyes and the left heel that came down half a beat late, and the patience of someone who understood that good things cannot be rushed. And she felt her voice rise from the place where it had been slowly returning to itself. I want this, she said, and her voice was not rough anymore, or not only rough, there was something fuller in it now, something that had come back with the practice of being heard. I want this very much. He let out a breath. Good, he said, and the word had the same quality as the one he had said at the dinner table in November when she had told him he mattered to her, as though something had been confirmed that he had hoped for and had been afraid to count on. He did not reach for her immediately. He looked at her with an earnestness that was almost formal and said, I'd like to court you properly. I'd like to call on you and take you to dinner and do this the right way. And when it feels right to both of us, I'd like to ask you to marry me, but that's later. Right now, I just want to know that we're agreed on the direction. We are agreed on the direction, Ruby said. He smiled, the full one. They ate the Christmas meal he had prepared in the small kitchen of the property house, which was simple food made carefully, and they talked for hours in the particular way of people who are discovering that conversation with the right person is not an expenditure of energy but a generation of it. He told her about Tennessee, and she told him about Missouri, and they found that they had been moving through the same country, different roads, arriving at the same table. When he rode her back to town in the late afternoon with the sun going orange red on the snow, she thought that this was what returning to yourself felt like. Not as dramatic as she might have imagined. Not an announcement, but a homecoming. Something quiet and warm and exactly right. The spring of 1883 built itself the way springs build in Kansas, with a violence of rain followed by an explosion of green that made the previous winter's bleakness seem impossible. The plains turned a color that Ruby, looking out the window of the mercantile, thought must be what the word verdant had been invented to describe. Wallace courted her properly, as he had promised. He called on her twice a week, and they walked and talked and sat on Harriet's porch in the evenings when the weather permitted, and Harriet herself chaperoned with a cheerful obliqueness that gave them enough space to be real with each other while maintaining the forms that Caldwell's social order required. Ruby discovered, over these months, what it felt like to be known, to have someone pay attention to her thinking, to her observations, to the things she found funny and the things that moved her. Wallace listened to her the way he had from the beginning, with the full weight of his attention, and she found that her voice, freed from years of captivity, had more in it than she had remembered. She had opinions about things. She had a sense of humor that emerged in the dry and understated register of someone who had observed a lot from a position of silence. She had feelings about books and about the sky, and about the particular injustice of the way women in their time were expected to diminish themselves to fit spaces that other people decided were the right size for them. She said this last thing to Wallace on an April evening when they were sitting on the top rail of the fence that ran along the edge of the Grady property, watching the sun go down in its extravagant Kansas way, all gold and pink and a particular shade of violet that had no name. It's wrong, she said. What's expected? And I knew it was wrong, and I didn't leave as soon as I should have, and I've asked myself why for 3 years. Wallace was quiet for a moment. Because it gets built into you, he said. The wrongness, they build it in so you start to think it's you. That's the particular cruelty of it. She turned and looked at him. Yes, she said. I want to say something, he said carefully, And I want you to hear it as a thing I mean truly and not as something I'm saying to say it." She waited. "You are not what he made you think you were," Wallace said. "You are the person you've been becoming since you got yourself out of there, and that person is extraordinary." Ruby sat with that for a moment, with the sunset doing its expressive best in front of them. "I'm beginning to believe that," she said. "Good," he said. "Keep going." He asked her to marry him in May, on a clear Saturday morning, at the property he had been preparing for them both. He had fixed the gate on the front fence and planted a line of young cottonwoods along the south side of the house, which would take years to grow but would eventually provide shade and the particular sound of cottonwood leaves in the wind, which Ruby had mentioned once, months ago, in passing, that she loved. He had remembered. He had planted them because he had remembered. He asked her at the front window, the one that faced west, and he held her hand and looked at her without performing the question, without theater, just Wallace, steady and honest and completely himself. "Ruby Sawyer," he said, "will you marry me and live here with me and tell me what the place needs to be a home, and let me spend the years I have being worth the listening?" Ruby's eyes were doing things she did not attempt to prevent. "Yes," she said. "Wallace Ford, yes." He put a ring on her finger that he had ordered from a jeweler in Kansas City, a simple gold band with a single small turquoise stone the same color. He said, "As the sky in September over the Indian Territory," which she had never seen and now had a reason to. He kissed her then, for the first time, standing at the west window with the plains spreading out around them, and it was careful and real, and entirely unlike anything she had experienced before in the category of being kissed, because it had in it the quality that everything about Wallace Ford had, which was the quality of meaning what you said. They were married in June, at the Caldwell Methodist Church, with Harriet Bloom in the front row crying productively and Wallace's sole witness, a tall, quiet man named Amos Birch, who had ridden with him for 6 seasons and traveled up from Texas for the occasion, standing beside him with an expression of weathered contentment. Ruby wore a dress she had made herself over the course of 2 months, ivory cotton with small blue flowers, because she was particular about what she wore and had the skill to make what she wanted, and because making the dress herself was a declaration of a certain kind, of a woman who had reclaimed the authorship of her own life. She spoke her vows in a clear and steady voice that filled the church, and when the minister said she might speak and she spoke, Harriet in the front row made a small sound and covered her mouth. Wallace looked at her throughout the ceremony with an expression that she would carry in herself for the rest of her life, the full, honest love of a person who had chosen her completely. They said the words together and signed the register, and rode out to their property in the noon light, and it was theirs. The low, solid house, and the young cottonwoods, and the west window, and the plains going on in every direction. The first months of their marriage had the particular character of 2 people learning the daily vocabulary of a shared life. They were careful with each other in the best way, attentive to the specific forms of consideration that make cohabitation feel like a gift rather than an obligation. Wallace learned that Ruby needed the first hour of the morning quietly before she was ready for conversation, and Ruby learned that Wallace processed difficult days through physical work, that if something had gone wrong with the cattle or the hands or the logistics of the operation, he would come in from an extra hour in the barn cleaner in his thinking. They learned these things not because they were told but because they paid attention, and paying attention was, Ruby thought, the entire curriculum of love. She kept working at the mercantile through the summer, riding in 3 days a week, because she loved the work and Harriet needed her, and because Ruby was not a woman who allowed marriage to be a reduction. Wallace had no argument with this. His own sense of what a marriage should look like was, fortunately, shaped by a practical recognition that capable people should do what they are capable of, regardless of the various social prescriptions about what women's capabilities were supposed to be. He said it plainly one evening, "I married you because of who you are. It would be foolish to then ask you to be someone else." Ruby sat across the supper table from him and thought that she would remember that sentence for a long time. In the autumn of 1883, Ruby told Wallace she was expecting. She told him at breakfast on a Tuesday because she had known since Monday and had spent Monday with the information, turning it carefully in her mind, and by Tuesday morning she was ready to say it. She sat down with her coffee and looked at him across the table. "I'm expecting a child," she said. "In the spring, I think." He set his cup down and looked at her with the full version of his attention, and his face went through something that took a moment to complete, a sequence of emotions that resolved, finally, into a joy so unguarded and complete that Ruby felt it as a physical warmth. "Ruby," he said. "I know," she said. He got up from his side of the table and came around and crouched beside her chair and took her hands in both of his and looked up at her. "Are you all right?" he said. "Are you happy about it?" She looked down at him, this man kneeling beside her chair, to look up at her face, and she said, "Yes, very much." "Good," he said. "Then I am too, completely." He pressed his forehead to their joined hands for a moment, and it was one of those moments that has no particular drama to it and will be remembered forever precisely because of that. Its ordinariness, its perfect ordinary significance. Winter came again, and Ruby spent it in the way of someone with a new relationship to time, aware of the passage of months in a physical way, the changes in herself that documented the season. She read Middlemarch for the first time all the way through, in the evenings by the stove, and told Wallace about it in considerable detail, and he listened to her opinions about Dorothea Brooke with the genuine engagement of someone who had discovered that Ruby's thinking about books was one of his favorite things. She also started writing again, not letters particularly, but a kind of journal that had no audience except herself, a practice she had abandoned in the Clement years, and which returned now with the same quality as her voice had returned, roughened at first and then increasingly itself. She wrote about the plains and the light and the cattle operation, and the particular way that Wallace hung his coat on the peg by the door every evening, left hook before right, a habit so established it had become a kind of temporal marker. She wrote about what it felt like to be in a life that was hers. The child was born in April of 1884, a boy, delivered by the doctor who rode out from Caldwell on a Wednesday morning when the prairie was green with the first week of spring. Wallace sat outside the bedroom door for 3 hours in a state of focused stillness that Harriet, who had come out to be present, described afterward as the most intense non-movement she had ever witnessed in a human being. When the doctor opened the door and said that everyone was well and healthy, Wallace went in and Ruby was in the bed with the boy in her arms, small and red-faced and entirely himself, and Wallace sat on the edge of the bed and looked at them both and could not speak, which Ruby noted with a particular fondness as the reversal of their original dynamic. "His name is James," Ruby said. James had been Wallace's father's name, which she had learned in the deep conversations of winter, and which she had chosen without announcing that she was choosing it. Wallace looked at her, and the expression on his face was the one she had catalogued variously as the warm thing, the full honest version, the complete unguarded thing, and she thought that this particular iteration of it was the most significant she had seen yet. "James," he said. "James Wallace Ford," she said, "if you agree." He covered his face with one hand for a moment. Then he uncovered it and looked at her and said, "I agree completely." James was a vigorous and opinionated child from the first weeks. He communicated his opinions loudly and without ambiguity, and Wallace and Ruby navigated the early months of parenthood with the cooperative attentiveness they had applied to the rest of their shared life. Wallace woke for the nighttime hours with a consistency that Ruby had not asked for, and which she recognized as the expression of a man who understood that partnership meant the work was also shared. The property developed around them. Wallace added a room to the house that spring, a proper study for Ruby with shelves that he built himself from the local cedar, sanded smooth and smelling of the timber. She put her books in it and her writing things and a chair by the window, and it became the room in the house that felt most specifically hers, which was exactly how Wallace had meant it. Harriet Bloom came out to the property once a month for Sunday dinner and kept them tied to the town's social fabric, bringing news and opinions and an appetite for Ruby's cooking that she expressed with unsuppressed enthusiasm. The mercantile had a new assistant, a young woman from Missouri named Clara who Harriet had hired with Ruby's help, and who reminded Ruby, in certain specific ways, of herself at an earlier age, which was a recognition she brought to the relationship with Clara carefully and deliberately. She told Clara one afternoon, while they were reorganizing the fabric stock, that she should not let anyone make her feel that her voice was an inconvenience. Clara looked at her with the expression of someone hearing something they needed to hear. "Sometimes," Ruby said, "the people who want you quiet are the ones who know that what you have to say is worth saying." Clara was quiet for a moment. "How do you know when to trust someone?" she asked. Ruby thought of Wallace, of the particular quality of his listening, of the cottonwood trees he had planted because she had mentioned once that she loved the sound of them. "They make room for you," Ruby said. "Not by step-aside courtesy, real room. They want you to be fully there, and they show it in the small things." Clara nodded slowly. "Find someone like that," Ruby said, "and be someone like that." The summer of 1884 was hot and productive, the cattle operation running well under Wallace's management, the calves from the spring having grown into a satisfying addition to the herd. James, in his basket, moved room to room with whoever was nearest him, observed the world with enormous dark eyes that had ended up, definitively, his father's warm brown. Ruby rode into Caldwell twice a week still, James beginning to accompany her in a carrier arrangement that Wallace had devised from the sort of practical ingenuity he brought to logistical problems. She was present in town, visible and speaking and fully there, in a way that Caldwell had entirely reorganized its understanding of her around. The people who had accepted her silence as permanent readjusted, mostly graciously, to the woman who had a great deal to say when speaking with someone she was comfortable with, and an opinion about the county's drainage planning that she had delivered to the relevant authorities in a letter of such precise and reasoned argument that the planning committee had discussed it for 2 meetings. She was herself, in all of her full dimensions, in a life that had room for every one of them. In the autumn of 1884, the Caldwell postmaster's wife, in the course of a social conversation, mentioned that a woman in the neighboring county had been attempting, without success, to leave a marriage that had the particular character of the marriages that Ruby knew something about, and had no means of legal advice or financial independence. Ruby thought about this for several days. Then she sat down at her writing desk in her cedar-shelved study and wrote a letter to a women's charitable organization in Topeka that she had read about in a newspaper, explaining what she had observed about the practical obstacles women in such situations faced, and what kinds of support might meaningfully address them. She wrote it in the careful, precise voice she had developed, that combined her schoolteacher father's grammatical rigor with her own years of observation and her personal knowledge of the subject. The organization wrote back. And then a correspondence began that would, over the following years, connect Ruby to a network of women across Kansas who were working, in the limited ways available to them within the laws and customs of their time, toward the practical improvement of other women's circumstances. It was not a revolution. She understood that it was a series of small, precise interventions, legal advice, referrals, financial information, the names of people who could help, provided quietly through letter and through word of mouth, in the spaces available within a society that was not always interested in making those spaces. But it was something. It was real, and she did it with her full voice and her full name. Wallace read one of her letters one evening, not intruding. She had shown it to him, and set it down and looked at her. "Ruby Sawyer Ford," he said, using all 3 names the way he did when he was particularly serious. "You are one of the most remarkable people I have ever had the privilege of knowing." She looked up from her writing desk and met his eyes. "I had to become her again first," she said. He came and stood behind her chair and put his hands on her shoulders, and she put one of her hands over one of his. "You became her," he said. "She was always there." By the spring of 1886, James was 2 years old and causing the particular species of cheerful chaos that 2-year-olds with strong personalities cause, and Ruby was expecting their second child, which she announced to Wallace over breakfast again, on a Tuesday again, because certain forms having proved reliable should be preserved. He reacted with equal joy but slightly more composure this time, having had the rehearsal, and managed to keep his coffee cup upright throughout. "Are you hoping for a girl or a boy?" he asked. "I'm hoping for healthy," Ruby said. "Correct," he said. The second child was a girl, born the following October, a clear-eyed and demanding infant who Ruby named Margaret after her own mother, and who, from the first weeks, demonstrated a vocal capacity that Ruby observed with a particular private amusement. "She is going to have opinions," Wallace said, looking at Margaret in her cradle. "She comes by it honestly," Ruby said. He looked at Ruby with the full, warm version of his smile. "That she does," he said. The cottonwood trees along the south side of the house were 3 years old now and had grown enough to make themselves known, their leaves beginning to take on the shimmering quality that would become, when they reached full maturity, the sound that Ruby had described once on a trail walk in October 1882, and which Wallace had carried with him untold, until he planted them. She had noticed them since the spring of 1883 and had thought she understood what they meant. It was only in the autumn of 1886, sitting on the front step with Margaret asleep in her arms and James playing in the dirt near the fence with the single-minded focus of 2-year-old engineering, and Wallace coming from the direction of the barn brushing hay from his coat in the evening light, and the cottonwoods going shh, shh, shh in the wind from the west, that she fully understood it. He had planted them in the future tense. He had planted them before they were married, before he had asked her, because he had already known that this was where they were going and he had started building it. She said, when he came and sat beside her on the step, "Wallace, the trees." He looked at the cottonwoods. "I planted them because you mentioned you loved the sound," he said simply. "You planted them before you asked me," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "I was fairly certain you were going to say yes," he said. She looked at him, this man, this careful, patient, honest man, and she felt the accumulated love of 4 years rise in her like water in a spring, full and clean and inexhaustible. "You were right," she said. He put his arm around her and she leaned against him, and the cottonwoods made their sound, and James looked up briefly from his engineering project to observe his parents, and then returned to it, and Margaret slept. And the planes went on in every direction in the last light of an October evening in 1886, the same light that had made the cottonwoods along the dry creek bed look like they were painted when Wallace Ford had first pointed them out to a woman who had not yet found her voice again. On a walk at the edge of a town that had expected her to stay quiet, she had not stayed quiet. She would not stay quiet. The years that followed were full and layered in the way that good years are, built not of dramatic events, but of the accumulating texture of a life lived with full attention. James at 4 was a boy of serious inquiries, fascinated by how things worked, why the cattle behaved as they did, what made the well pump on some pools and resist on others, whether horses thought about things and what sorts of things they might think about. Wallace answered every question with the same care he brought to everything, and when he didn't know the answer, he said so, and sometimes they worked it out together. Margaret at 2 was as Ruby had predicted, loudly opinionated and fearless in the application of her opinions. She had Wallace's brown eyes and Ruby's chestnut hair, and a personality that appeared to be entirely her own generation's contribution to the world. Ruby's correspondence with the Topeka organization had grown into something more substantial by 1888. She was writing regularly to 3 different groups and had been asked to contribute a practical account of her experiences and observations to a publication that circulated among women's reform organizations across the Midwest. She wrote it over 3 weeks, late in the evenings in her cedar study, and it was the most directly personal thing she had ever written for an audience, a careful and honest account of silence as a consequence of control and voice, as an act of recovery. She did not use her full name in the publication out of practical caution, but she used her initials, RSF, and Wallace read the finished piece sitting at the kitchen table, and when he was done he sat quietly for a moment and then said, "This is going to reach someone who needs it." "That's what I'm hoping," Ruby said. "It will," he said, with the certainty of someone who simply knew. Wallace's work on the Grady property had built his reputation in the county as a capable and reliable manager, and by 1889, when the Grady family decided to sell, they offered him the first option to purchase a portion of the land at a favorable price, on the basis that he had improved its value considerably through his management of it. It was a significant financial undertaking, requiring careful planning and a loan from a Caldwell bank, whose manager was, by fortunate coincidence, a man who had eaten at the same dinner tables as the Grady family for 20 years and trusted their assessment of Wallace's ability. Ruby sat with him through the loan negotiation, her presence in the room not decorative, the bank manager having been advised by Wallace from the first meeting that his wife was a partner in the enterprise, and he would not discuss it without her participation. The bank manager had looked briefly startled and then, reading the situation, had adjusted. They signed the papers together. The land was theirs, the house, the outbuildings, the young cottonwoods now tall enough to be mature and shading 38 acres of grassland that they would manage themselves going forward, their own enterprise, their own ground. Ruby stood at the west window the evening they came home with the signed papers and looked out at what was theirs. "We built something," she said. Wallace stood beside her at the window. "We did," he said. "From a supply order and a dinner across the street," she said. He laughed, the full version which she loved, which she had been making happen for 7 years and still found fresh each time. "You could put it that way," he said. "I could put it many ways," she said. "I have all my words back now." He turned and looked at her with everything he had in him, the full, honest, warm, brown-eyed weight of a man who had loved her through the finding and the becoming, and intended to keep going. "I know," he said. "I love every one of them." The Christmas of 1889 was celebrated in their house, their own house on their own land, with Harriet Bloom at the table and Amos Birch, who had retired from the trail and settled in Caldwell proper and visited regularly, and James, who was 5 years old and had opinions about everything, including the proper number of candles on the table, and Margaret, who was 3, and had expressed her view of the Christmas tree's decorative arrangements by rearranging them while everyone's back was turned. Ruby had cooked for 2 days. The kitchen smelled of cinnamon and roasted meat and coffee, and the cottonwoods outside in the winter cold made their dry winter sound, which was different from the summer sound, but she had come to love that version too. After dinner, when Harriet and Amos were settled with their coffee and James had fallen asleep on the rug by the stove with the thoroughness of a child who has run out of capacity, and Margaret was in her father's lap being told a story in the specific soft voice Wallace reserved for bedtime purposes, Ruby sat in her chair and looked at all of it and felt the full weight of it, the extraordinary, ordinary fullness of a life that was hers, chosen and built and maintained with love and intention. She thought of the woman who had stood behind a mercantile counter in October 1882, counting bolts of calico, believing her voice had nothing worth saying, and no one worth saying it to. She thought of the bell above the door. She thought of a man with a left heel that came down half a beat after the right. She thought of a note across a counter, "I will be done here at 6. She thought of a word in a dark doorway that had surprised her, "Good night." She had been so quiet for so long that she had truly forgotten her own voice. She had forgotten that it was hers, that it belonged to her and not to anyone else's definition of what she should or should not say. She had forgotten that it had things in it worth hearing. She had forgotten, most essentially, that she was someone worth speaking to. Wallace had not demanded her voice. He had not extracted it or coaxed it or made its return a condition of anything. He had simply made a space in which it became possible, in which she became possible again, in which the person she had always been underneath the enforced silence could find her way back up to the surface. He looked up from Margaret's story and found Ruby watching him, and he gave her the small private version of his smile across the room. She smiled back, fully, the complete version, her own. She had her voice. She had her life. She had this man and these children and this house on this land under this enormous Kansas sky, and she had the full use of herself, every word and thought and feeling, no longer compressed into silence, but given the room they required. Margaret had fallen asleep against Wallace's chest in the middle of the story, following her brother's example of efficient unconsciousness. He looked down at her with the expression he had worn the first time he had held her, the one that had no performance in it, just the pure fact of love. He stood carefully and carried Margaret to her bed, and Ruby covered James where he slept on the rug, and they met in the hallway between the two rooms in the quiet of the house on Christmas night, with Harriet and Amos dozing in their chairs in the front room, and the cottonwoods speaking their winter language outside. "Merry Christmas," he said quietly. "Merry Christmas, Wallace," she said. He put his arms around her, and she put her face against the warmth of his shoulder, and they stood in the hallway of their house on their land in the life they had built, and it was enough. It was exactly enough. It was full and real and entirely theirs, and it would go on being theirs in the daily and particular way that good lives go on, season after season, word by word, in the speaking and the being heard. Outside, the cottonwoods made their sound. Inside, Ruby Sawyer Ford breathed and held and knew herself completely. She would never be quiet that way again.